So thinking of, the loan officer and the salesperson, and we all know whether you want to call it a pre-qual, a TBD, a pre-approval, some things are going to change. So if you could, one, answer that for the loan officer, and then I think it's important that we teach loan officers how to be great leaders to realtors and set better expectations. So if you could kind of hit this twice, Mitch, what are pre-approvals from a loan officer's perspective, and what should they be telling realtors to set expectations?
All right, so let's talk about pre-approvals for a minute, because there's been a lot of conversation out there about pre-approvals and the fact that loan officers may not be able to do pre-approvals because they can't get information that they need to get a pre-approval done and things of that sort. You spoke earlier about misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation going on, especially around this particular issue. The truth of the matter is the requirement that's out there for pre-approvals is no different than the requirement that's in the rule that we're dealing with today for the good faith estimate. The rule that's in place today, Reg X of RESPA, specifically says it prohibits the lender from requiring as a condition for providing a GFE supporting or supplemental documentation to verify the information itself. So it exists today as well. Now, what the CFPB has done is they've incorporated what already exists, and they've clarified the restriction itself. You cannot require a consumer to submit documents verifying information collected for an application before you provide the loan estimate itself. Does that mean that you're not able to ask for information in order to do a pre-approval? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that, in fact, the consumer can voluntarily give you that information. You can suggest to a consumer that it might be easier, in fact, in the pre-approval process if they provide you with that information, as long as you tell them that it's got to be voluntary. You can't require it. Can you go out there and verify information yourself? Because a pre-approval is basically an approval with very limited conditions. It's an approval on something where you don't have that property address typically, and the conditions you place on it are very, very limited. And so you've underwritten that loan and you said, okay, you can be approved, you will be approved subject to the following limited set of conditions itself. So of course you're going to need to go out there and verify information. You can verify that information yourself. You can't ask the consumer, you can't require that the consumer bring that information to you. So can you say to the consumer, bring me your bank statements, bring me your pay stubs? No. The answer is no to that. Can you go forward and start the verification process along those particular lines? Yes. The purpose here, the purpose of this particular provision that says that you can't require the consumer to bring you documentation and specific supporting and verifying information prior to the loan estimate being given, the purpose is to prevent burdening the consumer. It's to avoid overburdensome documentation demand on applicants and really to give them time to facilitate shopping so they can compare and they can, in fact, go ahead and look around. So the CFPB themselves has said that this particular rule is not going to affect pre-approvals as long as the consumer is not required to provide verifying documentation themselves. But they can provide documentation voluntarily. Obviously, they can go ahead along those particular lines. You can't condition the ability to submit an application on completion of the pre-approval process. But many times, for a variety of different reasons, the consumer doesn't have an address yet, and they need that pre-approval so they know what they otherwise get, or a seller may in fact look at them and say, listen, until I know that you have been pre-approved, I'm not going through with this particular deal. I'm not going to contract that. So voluntarily, can they give you specific documentation themselves? Yes. Can you otherwise go ahead in the process and verify the documentation for a real pre-approval? Absolutely. We're not talking about a pre-qualification, which has a completely different meaning and which has many, many, many more conditions that are applicable to it. But a HMDA pre-approval itself is something that you're bound by as long as they otherwise go forward and meet the conditions that you set out for them. And yes, the process isn't going to be any different than it is today.
I think other than the fact that we're going to have to be more careful with our words, because I think loan officers, and legally there's a big difference between a pre-qual and a pre-approval. But as an industry, you talk to 10 different loan officers, you get 10 different answers. So one last thought before we move off this question: what should loan officers be telling realtors so that they're setting expectations? One, they're being leaders today, and two, they're setting expectations with their agents so that it goes smooth. I mean, you've seen some of the news where they're telling realtors there's going to be 15-day delays in closing. That doesn't pertain to this, but what is your leadership there?
Yeah, well, there aren't going to be 15-day delays in closing unless someone has done something wrong in the process itself. It really shouldn't be that bad. The truth of the matter is that loan officers now are going to have to be much more hands-on with their partners, with realtors and with other partners in the transaction itself, and with the consumer, quite frankly. They're going to have to communicate and constantly communicate and let them know where they are in the process itself, so they know what the expectation is, and so that they can collectively, with the real estate agents, manage the borrower's expectations. So what do the real estate agents need to know? Well, they need to know what the time requirements are from the beginning to the end. They need to know about the 3 business day requirement once you have the application, so they know and understand when the consumer, in fact, is given a loan estimate. Why is that important? Because the consumer has those 10 days before they have to tell you that they have an intent to proceed. But obviously they can tell you that earlier as well. So real estate agents need to understand that 10-day period of time. That could cause delay in the process if in fact the consumer or the applicant sits on that for the full 10-day period before you go forward and are able to, in fact, collect your fees and start the actual process of getting approval for this particular loan transaction. So the intent to proceed 10-day requirement is very, very important. What else is important? What scares real estate agents and what scares home builders and others along those particular lines? It's missing the closing date, missing the date of consummation, especially if those dates are set out in the contract itself. And so what do they need to know about that? They need to know the requirement that a closing disclosure be given to the consumer, provided to the consumer 3 business days before closing. That's important because at least early on in this particular process, as this rule comes into effect in August, there are going to be some mishaps. There are going to be some times when, in fact, you're going to miss a closing date. You ought not miss very many of them, quite frankly, as long as you prepare in advance, as long as your company really is on the ball on this particular issue. But there may be some over there, and realtors need to understand that. So the most important thing they really need to know is the timing requirements, the fact that they need to assist. They need to help you manage the borrower's expectations. That's very, very important. And in terms of pre-approvals, I mean, many realtors today, many real estate agents today say, I'm happy to help you look for a house, but I want to see a pre-approval. Depending on which market they're in, but many real estate agents do that. And you need to understand what we just went through. You need to make them understand that particular process. You need to let them know that you can't require that that borrower give you that supporting information, give you that verifying information, but in fact, you can let the borrower know that they can voluntarily do it. That will help the process move along quicker along those particular lines. So it's all about communicating, educating, and managing the borrower's expectations.